I'm going to share with you just some things about string pedagogy. I imagine that all of you study that subject matter and probably have at some point in your life. Many of you will be teaching. And who's teaching? Yeah, most of you will be teaching. And if you teach with a sense of attention, you will find that a lot of the issues in teaching are also the issues in playing. Obviously, these two activities are very related. And in fact, teaching is a really useful way to make explicit to yourself what you might be doing yourself. So a good teacher is somebody who actually learns possibly more than the student. So that's the reason why I teach. I'm not a selfless person. I'm completely egoistic in this regard. I want to learn. I'm fascinated by learning. I think a teacher needs to be fascinated by learning how learning works. And there's a couple of fundamentals in that activity that are immediately obvious. A teacher needs to think in terms of what the student will do. What's the response of the student? It's no good, say, analyzing a problem or outlining even a solution if the student doesn't follow you. So the first thing about teaching is it requires a different type of thinking. It requires what we call didactic thinking. And that's a thinking which considers what is going to happen in response to what I do as a teacher. That's very important. At no time must the teacher forget that the other, the student, and the learning itself is to be advanced. And if I forget that, and I forget that consistently, well, then I can do anything and say anything I want. It won't be effective, it won't arrive. And in our area of our discipline, one of the issues is very difficult to define quality. It's a very subjective discipline, and aesthetic disciplines are always very subjective. So often we come up to the question is, what is good teaching? It's a puzzling question. We answer that often with saying a good teacher is somebody who does good teaching. Well, who is a good teacher? Somebody who's got lots of good students. Well, we already see that doesn't really make that much sense, but it's often used. He must be a good teacher because he's got lots of good students. Well, there might be a better teacher who has lots of less bad students, if you like. So it's difficult to understand where is this activity actually manifesting itself in terms of quality. And one thing we must do in response to that question, I think, is to examine the activity of teaching itself, learning itself in our area, and to try to reflect back on its foundations. And that's what I'm trying to kind of do today. And then we get to a sense in which teaching is an art. So what we need to consider, first of all, if we want to think about teaching as an art, this is something that Carl Flesch very much believes, that string teaching, violin teaching is actually an art. It's something that involves a certain amount of craft and skill, but it also involves intuition, imagination, sensitivity. But essentially, we have basically three areas that we need to think about in pedagogy, I feel. One is the area of method. Yeah? It's the way we develop our skills. I'll talk a bit about that more. The other one is the area of stuff. We call it curriculum, and that's very important because it is the reference point for our development of skills. So if you want to develop your teaching, you need to think a lot about curriculum. You need to think about how you organize material, etc. like that. And the third area, I feel that's important because violin playing or string playing is not just an activity of functional skill. It's actually an existential undertaking. It's a spiritual undertaking. There's a lot of dimensions of development that goes far beyond just being able to do something well. It reaches into the areas of our soul, if you like. Because of that, the persona of the teacher is actually very important. It's the persona or the character of the teacher, if you like, the ethos of the teacher, the approach and the habits and the commitments we demonstrate as teachers is very important. That actually has direct manifestations into the learning of the student. We must not forget that either. So that's why it's very important we consider all those three areas. First of all, let's talk a few minutes about method. Method is an interesting concept. Methodos, it comes from the Greek, which means the path towards. So method is basically a path on which we develop skill, or through which we develop the skills and abilities and performative capacities in the student. And there are two theoretical notions, perhaps psychological notions, that I find are very important. The first one comes from a Russian a linguist, actually a language educator by the name of Vygotsky. Vygotsky believed that skills are developed in a way that we can distinguish, first of all, autonomous skills from those that are not autonomous. And Vygotsky's model is that the student has a number of things the student can do without any help, completely autonomously. And then there comes what he calls a zone of proximate development, which is skills the student can do with some help, some simplification, some assistance. And then there comes the realm of skills which a student cannot yet do at all. So Vygotsky says learning occurs best when we work into the zone of proximate development. So we work from the level of skills that the student can do autonomously towards that and expand that into the zone of proximate development. And I think in the Russian string or violin method, it's known as a step-by-step approach eventually. But Vygotsky comes out of that same time, 1930s, 1940s, etc. And that is a very influential idea, simple idea, that we are structuring our development in this way. What it means basically, we are not going to say to a student, just have a go at that really difficult piece. You have no hope of getting most of the things, but you just want to push yourself or something like this. That's going to usually not end up well. So and the model there is the Vygotsky zone of proximate development. Another important psychological element that is developed in a theoretical sense by the Hungarian psychologist Csikszentmihalyi is the idea of flow. So learning occurs best, you could say, when it is in a sort of flow state. What does that mean? Csikszentmihalyi went out and researched people who were, he said, supremely happy in their life, optimal experience, he called it. He said, how come that some people are distinguished by this notion of optimal experience? So he says, well, they live often very simple life, do very simple things, but what happens in their case is that there's a great equilibrium, a great balance between the expectation and the outcomes. So what that means for us in terms of teaching and learning is that if a student has huge expectations and very low outcomes, we frustrate the learning process. So we optimize the learning process by enabling the students to reach their expectations. Now we also know that we can achieve that in a number of ways. We can achieve that by lowering our expectations and in that sense creating a balance between expectation and outcome. But we also know from research that students are most successful, learn best when the expectations are quite high. So what that means is we set the expectations relatively stringently, but we also enable the student to achieve the outcomes relatively quickly speaking. Does that make sense? So it's this balance of expectations and outcomes we work with all the time. And that's very important to progress our method, right? So this is about the dynamic of our method. It's more about the way we pace it and the flow of the method and the direction of the method of our path is going to be structured. Of course, there are some issues about the content of our method. I'm going to go into that a bit more. What are we actually focusing on when we're developing the skills? What are the foundational ideas there? When we're trying to teach or develop the young musician? Well, there are in string playing a number of determinations. First of all, the idea of being a musician in the first instance, what does that mean? Well, somebody can express something through tones, right? So obviously there has to be a priority in our development on that expressive side. Then the second thing is very important is the technique of a violinist is constituted through movement. And that makes it very different from an oboe player or a singer. So it's very important to understand how does movement work. How do we actually work with movement? How do we develop our capacity to employ movement or recruit movement for the purpose of expression? And then the third thing is that the performance is a public event, it's public, and that creates a certain, say, pressure and demand on the student. It means that our performance has to be structured in such a way that we only have one chance to do it, and that's it. We can't turn back, we can't stop, etc. So that imposes certain content definitions on our method. That's sort of in a very general sense. I'll talk about this some more. I want to talk a bit about curriculum very briefly. I mean, a lot of this needs some more detail, and I sort of point you to literature. You need to, if you're serious about your discipline, both as a performer and as a teacher, you need to read literature in these areas. You need to start doing your own work, reflective work, observation work, and research, because to become a good teacher takes decades, in my experience, because it's a very intricate and detailed task. So, and we can't do it in a sort of automatic way. If we do it in an automatic way, we really run the risk of eroding our enthusiasm for this activity very quickly. I know a lot of frustrated teachers, and you usually recognize them by they saying, oh, I have only untalented students. Well, if you don't have untalented students, don't teach. If that's your view, then don't teach. Because you lost obviously already the interest in their learning, because you're making excuses why they can't learn something. If we find ourselves in this area, we need to stop immediately. It's a frustration in teaching that is very common. We can't really do anything much with that. So anyway, curriculum is one of those areas you need to research. My favorite formal kind of structure for it is the Fleschian one. Karl Flesch distinguished 3 areas of curriculum: exercise, studies, and repertoire. Now you can get more detail there, calls it applied technical material studies. But basically the idea is that the main development, the main skill of the student sits in the applied technical material, not in the repertoire. The repertoire needs to be slightly easier, because the student needs to have a freedom of imagination, a freedom of expression that is no longer bound by technical obstacles. So a student needs to be going on stage with a repertoire that feel, I can play this easily. Yeah? Whereas in the applied technical material, you can expand it a bit. There are musical challenges in that area, of course, as well, but they're contained somewhat. And where we are challenging the student, of course, is in the area of general technical material. So you can work on tense with the student by all means, but don't give them a piece in tense just yet, unless they have a sense of ease. They can play that with a sense of ease. So it's very important to try to structure material and curriculum in a way that is actually conducive and respects the public nature of the activity. So just a little bit about what I call the ethos. Ethos is, again, it's a Greek word, means habit, actually. We need to develop habits as teachers, just like we develop habits as performers. And one of our habits needs to be to understand that it's the student that learns. The student needs to be autonomous in that learning. When the student goes on the stage, there's the student there by herself. We are not there. We can't correct anything. So that has massive ramifications for the way we work with the student. If a student comes and looks at you with, for example, it's very common, a student might play for you, and every time they make a mistake, they look at you. Why are you doing that? They look for help, because you're such a nice person. You're going to help them fix things. But what you have to say to the student, sorry, I'm not there on stage. I can't help you fix things. You need to fix things yourself. And I think we can be very, we can be very demanding. We can say to the student, you don't come to lessons with problems. I'm not here to fix your problems. I'm here to give you more problems, if you like. But I want to see your creativity at work. I want to see the solutions. And if you develop that mindset as a student, then you pay attention to yourself, and you will be able to progress your playing in the practice room. So the ethos has to really go back to enforcing that we support the student in their autonomy. We help the student to become autonomous in their learning. That means we show them how to control frustration, or how to work with their own natural frustration. We give the student, of course, the method to find solution to progress their playing, and not just after 6 months, immediately and quickly. So the student has the experience of learning every minute of the day when they're practicing, and certainly in your lessons. So when you give a lesson, I often say to the people in Sydney, you must ask yourself, has the student learned something? You can ask a student, but it's better you ask yourself, because it's more truthful. The student might say, yes, I've learned a lot, you're such a wonderful teacher, but that might not be the case. So you have to ask yourself, has the student learned something? If you feel that the answer is no, you must give your money back. You can't charge for something that hasn't been effective. So what we teach basically in order for the student to become autonomous is creative thinking. Yeah. So we need to teach the student the original form of creative thinking, of inventing their playing in an autonomous and consistent way. Now, how does this actually work? One of the things we often neglect in our performance art is temporality. And I'll make this very simple schema of performance. What does it say? At the beginning of our playing process, let's say we make it very simple. We play a C sharp, a public performance of a C sharp. What happens at the beginning of this process is our intention. That's quite complex. We have an imagination for the tone. We have an imagination for the bow movement, for the finger, whatever. So we could just call that intention. What happens next? That intention is released in the external world. It's made, that C sharp is sounding now. At this point, what happens? We are hearing the C sharp, the audience is hearing that C sharp, and so are we as performers. Now, the interesting part about this schema is that with this perception, we can no longer influence this intention, not directly. We cannot directly influence this intention. Now, you need to think through the momentous challenge that provides to us. And you need to think through the implications for our methodology. If you want to fix anything, if you want to advance anything in the playing, the area where you need to work is here, not there. It's too late. Yeah, are you following that? This has a huge implications for how we approach things. How we, not only in terms of really concrete practice methods, that too, but also in how we relate to the student in their performance. If we spend all our time telling the student what we hear and what's wrong with their playing, we might, all we might do is enforce frustrations, right? What do we do instead? We need to direct the student's attention to the capacity to detail and improve their conscious intent. Yeah. So there's a big confusion in our attitude to performance and action in general. The confusion is between the relationship between perception and imagination, right? Of course they inform each other, but perception, purely perception, is too late, right? And anything that's based on perception, solely based on perception, is going to be trapped in a temporal locality that has no longer a chance to improve directly our performance. Now, of course, you can take that, you can critique that model. I just want to show you as an illustration of the challenges we have when we are teaching performance. And there's more. We have public performance as our goal. Why? It's actually good to have public performance. If you have students who say to you, I don't want to perform, I'm too nervous. You want to say, okay, we need to solve that. We need to find a way in which we can perform, because you will think much better. My favorite quote from Samuel Johnson is, nothing focuses a person's mind more than the thought that they're going to be hanged in the morning. So this idea that you need to commit to a process which leads to an unequivocal outcome. So an outcome that cannot be reversed means you're going to have to focus better. So you're going to have to learn more. So we have to welcome that, because we're going to do much better work, right? And we're going to think much better as a result, right? So we need public performance, but public performance, of course, has challenges, which are indicated here. The amygdala. The amygdala is the pre-brain which signals danger to us, or which responds to danger signals. You're using it now all the time, because if a bear jumped through that door, you'll be out of fear, and you look at each other out there and say, well, how do we get out of there? What happens? The amygdala is active when you are stepping just about in front of the bus, but as if in a miracle, you're pulled back. So the amygdala is that which filters your perceptions and scans them for danger, and in a pre-conscious state, turns off the system of conscious reflection and turns it on to automatic fright or flight, freeze or flight mode. Yeah, so it saves your life. The amygdala. That's what it's meant to be. It's quite active. Some people have it more active, some others. it becomes very active when you perceive a situation as dangerous. How does that work? Well, if your upper body tenses, for example, your amygdala says, hey, there's something wrong here. Must be dangerous. I'm out of here. Get out of here, quickly. So we realize that physical responses, the way your body is affected by or has been habituated, may well trigger the amygdala. That's why teachers talk a lot about tension and why we shouldn't be tense, etc., and why we should balance movements, because it contains the danger signals to your amygdala when you are about to play. And that's really important, because the amygdala is going to be more active when you're in front of people anyway, already. So the techniques we need to contain that are similar to meditation or relaxation techniques. So one of the things we should all do is teach our students how to do something like progressive relaxation. Yeah, because especially in today's world, the stimulus is so large that the amygdala is probably more active than the amygdala of our grandparents, because we perceive constant stimulus and constant danger. In fact, we love it. We play computer games where we shoot people. That's our kind of, wow, we really enjoy this energy. But of course, it's not a good energy to play the violin, because the energy to play the violin needs to be that of our intuition. And that doesn't really thrive on reactiveness. We must be very clear there. So the amygdala is a big factor, and the one chance performance, the one chance rule, is a big factor. How can we get across that? Because one of our desires in performance is security. We don't want to make a mistake in front of people. That's a socially embarrassing thing to do. That's why we get nervous. We get nervous because we feel socially embarrassed. Yeah? So how do we work with this? Often our response is, well, let's automate the movement. Let's automate everything and just stand here and rattle things off. If I had done that with this lecture, you'll be so bored and asleep that you wish you'd be just as bored and asleep as you are now. So what we need instead to do is we need to think in the action. We need to learn to think in the moment, in this somewhat dangerous moment. And we are not so special in that. Just imagine if you become a race car driver. You can't automate that. You need to think all the time, because you are every time you go around your Nürburgring with your 300 horsepower Ferrari, there could be something else happening. Yeah, a pigeon flies across. Well, you need to be thinking in that action. But not only that, you're racing other people. Yeah, so you've got to be thinking in that action. And a lot has to do with our ability to determine temporality. Now I told you something which is not on the slide, but that's simple as that. Our experience of temporality, of our experience of time, is as Aristotle says, in the mind. Aristotle says the mind is counting the nows in the before and after. So in other words, our perception of time, our conception of time is internal. It's not out in the world. It's not like your clock there is moving across the space. Yeah? That's not time. That's a form of measurement of time that's standardizing our perceptions. Time is within our experience. And if Aristotle is right that time is the counting of the nows in the before and after, then if I count many nows, then there's lots of time. And if I count only a few nows, there's little time. And that explains why people like the famous cricketer Donald Bradman, an Australian, said, when the cricket ball flew to me, I could see the stitching on the ball, on the leather of the ball. Why? Because he was able to slow his perceptions, right? His perception through his anticipation was so acute that he determined how fast that ball was flying subjectively. It wasn't that the ball flew at 140 kilometers and that was it. Everyone perceives that the same way. Clearly not the case. Through training of attention, we actually structure attention, and we are able even to determine temporal experience. That's very important to understand. Yeah, very, very important. And that's at the basis of high performance activities, of course. We know that also from research. For example, elite tennis players, there's research on cognitive science and on elite tennis players. You can sort of occlude their perception, like to put a helmet on them and then then narrow their field of vision, which means they can't anticipate as well because they don't see as much. And it's quite clear that their reactions are just the same as yours. The reason why they play so well is not because they react faster, or you react just as fast, but the reason why you're not an elite tennis player, well maybe you are, is because your anticipation of what's going to happen is not as acute. Not because your reactions are not as acute. So that's quite clear in sports. So this idea that when I see something happening and I know it's going to do that, if I'm good at that, then the temporal process, the experience of time between my realization and the outcome here is much larger. It's much, in other words, the activity seems much slower. I experience much slower. That's very interesting there. So it's a structure of attention that occurs there. So, what do we have? Artistic performance. Well, that's the activity we want to actually teach, develop. So there are a few elements here, which basically is a summary of what we talked about. And not all of this is relevant, but what we are teaching is a form of creativity, so not a problem solving. We're not addressing students' problems primarily. The student has to do that herself. We are teaching the student how to do that in a way, or assisting the student how to discover that, if you like. And we are promoting the productive imagination in that sense that the imagination constitutes the play. The second thing is that constitution has a number of modalities, you could say, dimensions. Rhythmic, what else is here? Expressive, structural, tone, feel, etc. These are complex content. This is complex content of our consciousness. So that constitutes the performance. If you sit here and you imagine yourself playing a piece you're just playing at the moment, yeah, you can do that. Yeah, what do you imagine? What do you do? What's happening? Tell us. What's the modality in which you do that? You're hearing. You can hear the tone. What else? What else can you do?
Imagine movements. Maybe.
The body. You can imagine the balance of the body. Exactly. You can imagine the feel of the fingers, the tactile sense. You can imagine a whole lot of stuff, including the timing, right? So that's what I mean here. It's the productive imagination that structures the contents of our consciousness. And make no mistakes, that is not something for university students. That's something for 6-year-olds. Yeah, 6-year-olds can do this. In fact, they can do it better than us because we are already contaminated by all this analysis. Yeah, and if you teach consistently with that in mind, your little students will play like whizzes. Scary, because their ability to use their hippocampus, I think, is what's been used for that, is really undistracted. Yeah. And of course, some of the performers that are labeled as talented just discovered that by fluke, and some of those who are labeled as untalented just underwent a rigorous process of technical analysis. And see, the situation, what happens in this area in string teaching is this. It's called the Pareto. You know about the Pareto principle. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So imagine this. You have a student and the student plays out of tune. You say to the student, you're playing out of tune. The student knows they're playing out of tune most of the time already. But you say, you're playing out of tune. Why are you not listening? Are you not listening? Okay, I'm listening. Now the student uses much less of their productive imagination and more of the fear and reaction to the fact that they're playing out of tune. So they play again, they play even worse. They play more out of tune. You say, again, you're playing out of tune. Within a few repeats, you've got ruined that person's chance to actually play in tune by labeling. I mean, it's a very simple thing, but that's the rich get richer, poor get poorer, right? If the student plays by fluke in tune, and you say, wow, you're playing in tune, the student will relax and use more of their productive imagination. Next time they play again, it's more natural, the anticipation works better, and the student plays well or even better. They say, wow, you're talented. So you see this is where I'm leading to. So that we must keep in mind, right? Okay, let's talk a bit more now about some of the foundations of our actual discipline in concrete terms. One of the things we have first is movement. Movement is our, let's have to check this. Movement is the central feature of our what we call technique. I have a view that we shouldn't talk about technique, but that's maybe for a different lecture, or it'll come up. What's movement? What's the characteristic about movement? Well, movement is unlike this. See, this is also movement, mechanical movement. I'm just moving this on a hinge here, but what this movement is, it's just purely mechanical, and there are several things missing that are present in human movement. One is, for starters, balance. So when I move my arm, what moves? My conscious decision is to move my forearm, but what moves? Come on, observe, what moves? Tell me. Yeah, the elbow. Well, I'm moving this consciously. I want to move this just like I wanted to move this. So this is moving actively, but what else moves? Come, obvious. Everything. It's like a wobble. You see? This wobbles and this wobbles. And if I just restrict that, we could call it passive movement. I think we sometimes call it passive movement. If I restrict that, this is not going to work. Right? This is a very important principle about movement. We often achieve much better result by focusing our attention on the passive movement, on allowing the movement and promoting the active movement, because the fact is, if I do this, and I try to do this, and I practice this really hard, and I practice it for years, it's never going to get any better. Yeah? So it's much more powerful to concentrate on the balance of the movement than the movement itself, which gives us the thought that we allow the movement to occur. And that, of course, coincides with the constitution of the human being. Our movement is not directed by our conscious manipulative consciousness. It's directed by our autonomous nervous system. Yeah? So that's the first thing, balance. The other thing is, movement is that, how do you move in the first instance? Move your finger. Schopenhauer discovered that. You know, the philosopher Schopenhauer. How come that's possible? How come your finger is not moving all the time, for example, or at random? How come? Why did you laugh? What did you detect? A lack of intentionality, right? I didn't want to move. Well, I did, but a random movement that just occurs randomly is not let's put it this way, our movements do not occur randomly. We determine them. I want to move my finger, I intend to move my finger. It's connected to my intentionality. And therefore, my finger is not an object. Yeah? It's not an object for me. My finger is an extension of my thinking. Yeah? It's directly connected to my thinking. My intentionality determines not only that the finger moves, but how it moves. And how do I do that instead of that? I use my imagination. I think I want to do these and aim the finger, right? Here's my, because you're looking tired, let's do this. Here's my little example. Stand up, everyone. Make a bit of space around you. Hold, listen carefully to my instruction. Put your arm to the side, not to the front. I'm not allowed to instruct that as a German. Just to the side. Just to the side. Okay, are you ready? To the side. Now listen carefully. Drop your arm. Is it clear what I said? Once more. It's a complex instruction. Drop your arm. Okay, second experiment. Move your arm to the side. Move your arm with the same speed. Move your arm with the same speed as you just did. Is that a difficult instruction? Let's do it once more. I didn't move my arm because I want to see what you do. Okay, so I won't move my arm, but drop your arm. Now, once more. Move your arm with the same speed. Why didn't you do that? Most of you didn't do that. You did something else. What did you do?
Same speed as what confused me? Same speed as when we were dropping, or same speed as you lifted it, or same speed as...
Oh, don't give me that. That's just evasive. No, what did you do? How did you move the arm? There was a different movement. Who had a different movement? Yes, exactly. What was different? You can sit down again.
I
think intentional.
It was intentional. The description suggested different intent. 1, dropping, passive. 2, moving, active. And instead of, like, I've not met many people that actually just dropped it initially. It's quite rare. But of course that's logical to do. You just drop it again because it's meant to be the same speed, for God's sake. So you do, but no, we here, move the arm, active, so we do this. And then you think, when I practice this 100,000 times, am I going to get to this? No, only if I get very tired, right? And that's called violin practice. Often. Now, what this example illustrates is that movement changes with our intentionality. That's it. Not with our practice. It changes with our idea what we're going to do, right? So movement is directly expressing our intentionality, and the way we relate to movement is metaphorically, we say. I'm not really dropping my arm, it's still attached. It's just as if dropping. I'm kind of moving my arm, but you know what I mean. The metaphor is different, therefore the movement changes. That's very important for our methodology. Say, when you say, move your arm for God's sake, drop your arm, the student will behave very differently. Yeah? And that's also our chance. Don't move your fingers, just drop them. Right? Movement changes. And this third thing about movement is its timing. What do I mean? Well, if intentionality determines movement, then obviously it matters at what time I move. If I move before the intent, I move randomly, right? So what does that mean? For our concrete example, many people do this. We move randomly, we complain about the fact that we didn't achieve what we wanted, and we move randomly again. It's called gambling. It's like you go to the casino, you put money on 15, you turn it, lost. What do? What's the response? Put money on 16, lost again. That's gambling. It's not going to be successful. Why? Because it's a process we can't control. It's a process of chance. So if our randomness determines the movement, or if the movement is determined by randomness, then likely over time, especially, frustration will contaminate the movement entirely. So what do we need? We need a business model for movement. We need to say to the student, when you move in response to your thought. Your thought is first, your intentionality is first. Make that explicit, and then move. Right? Is that clear? That's really important, because often in response to movement that's late, we will try harder. And when we try harder, we increase the disorder, the randomness of the movement. Yeah, it's quite obvious. It's like, I use the example, if you get up, your house is 20 minutes away from the conservatorium. Your first class is at 9 o'clock. Yeah? You get up at 8:45. What are you going to have to do? You're going to have to run. So, yeah, you have to run there. There's no chance. Yeah, you know that feeling, yeah? You know that. You know that situation. You're very familiar with the situation.
The exact same
Yeah.
hours
So-
happened today.
Yeah, exactly. So, taken from real life, you know that situation? Now, you come to the conservatorium, you're exhausted, you're puffing and huffing, and you think your colleagues will say, well, you need to do some gym practice, you need to train running, because, no, your colleagues will say, get up earlier. Get up early so you can walk. Yeah? So what does it teach us? Energy is directly related to timing. If something is late, we're going to increase the energy initially until we realize it's too late and we miss the bus. In which case we thought, bugger, why did I run? That was a stupid idea. Yeah? If we are philosophical, we'd say, well, if I'm too late, I'm too late. That's it. There's no point trying to make up for time. You cannot beat time. Nietzsche says that time is the stone you can't turn. Right? And in philosophy, you have this idea that because of time, we become resentful, because we realize we're powerless against the past. And that actually happens in violin playing. Yeah? After a while, we become resentful to ourselves because we never understood the issue of time, which gave us the power over our playing. Time gives us the power over our playing, not structure, not form. Form and structure are the result of time. Is that clear? So we need to teach the power over time. Now there's an aesthetic element to movement which is very important to us, which is the fact that musical shape and musical movement, through the fact that we have a bow, is directly responsible for artistry. And I realize that time is getting away. So despite the things I said, I'm not going to get through much of this. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We just stay here a bit, because the important thing in violin playing is the realization that movement has specific characteristics that I just sort of tried to outline, but it is also a direct reflection of what happens in music. Music is movement. Hanslick, the philosopher or music critic, often said of the 19th century, said that at the beginning of his treatise on the musically beautiful. He says, no one has remarked much about the fact that music is motion, that there is motion in music, and that music is therefore, for Hanslick, sounding, moving form. So Hanslick was very clear on an aesthetic level that movement, motion, was very, very central to music, musical form in motion. And of course we understand that, because if you use your bow for phrasing, you actually use movement to explicate, to articulate motion, movement, yeah? Shape, sounding, moving form. And I guess I sort of take a shortcut, because I do want to maybe give you a chance for a few questions. When we think through the details, the foundational details of our activity further, right, we come to the point, obviously, in which the instrument, if you like, is introduced to the body. So at this point we realize that movement is not just a process of intentional manipulation, but it's a way in which we adapt to the entire system of instrument, bow and body, if you like, or in which we embody the instrument. So our teaching has to develop embodied thinking, right? When we start to play the violin, we no longer playing in an object. And that's another important feature about movement and things. Think of the way you use a pencil. At the moment of writing, like you're writing with a pen, the pen disappears. The pen is no longer an object for you. The pen is an extension of your hand, right? And it follows your intentionality of just writing the words. And it's similar to the instrument. The instrument is not a foreign object for us, right? We are not manipulating the instrument. The instrument is not, unlike a tool, a kitchen knife, a chainsaw. The instrument is not a tool in that sense. The instrument is part of our body, as is our arm or our fingers. So in that sense, once we think about the activity in this way, we realize that the instrument is actually wonderfully ergonomically thought out as an extension of our body. It has the same characteristic that our body has, namely a skeletal structure, the wooden structure, and a muscular ligamentary structure, which is the bow hair, the strings, that is elastic. And when we understand that, we realize how our embodied thinking can project itself into that connection of the instrument with the bow. Now, this is a very unusual way of thinking. This is what we call holistic. And one of the challenges we have as Western people that are brought up in a history of science and analysis and Cartesian dualism, the idea that there's a mind and a body and the two sort of are in communication at best, the idea that we have through that actually prevents us from thinking this way about the instrument, right? But when you think further and you try to preserve a holistic perspective, there are a number of people who have sort of articulated, one of them notably the famous English cellist William Pleath. So if you read his book, you find a lot of this kind of idea. And usually those people are very effective in their teaching. Yankelevich was another one. He would never see the instrument and the bow as a kind of tool in that sense. There was always this idea of psychophysical unity that engages with this activity and tries to. But where was I? So once you see it in this way, you realize that the process of learning to play an instrument is a process of adaptation to the situation. And the people in philosophy, for example, who have articulated that very early already in the 20th century, people like Merleau-Ponty, they worked with people who were shot to pieces in the First World War and had to use prostheses and sticks. And Merleau-Ponty clearly articulates that. He says, the blind person sees with a stick. It's not a stick for the blind person, it's a stick for you because you don't know what to do with it. But for the blind person, it is an extension of the body. It's their eyes, in a real sense. And for us as violinists, the bow and the instrument can become our voice. And actually, economically, that's constructed this way. So, what's very important here to realize is that what I've outlined about timing and movement filters directly into the details of our playing, and I want to just spend 2 or 3 minutes to try to outline what I mean. It's clear that in terms of violin playing, first of all, the instrument has to be placed on the body in such a way that there is no need to hold it, but it needs to be balanced through the process, a bit like riding a bicycle, right? You're stable on the bicycle as long as you move. When you stop moving, you kind of fall off, So what that shows is the temporal process, the dynamic process stabilizes form. But I don't want to speak too much about this idea of the setup. More important or immediately striking is the fact that the left hand is silent, right? When you just play with your left hand, it's silent. And Lucien Capet articulates that clearly. He says the left hand is material and this is the form. So our movement in the left is different from our movement in the right, attitudinally, if you like. And on top of that, there needs to be a temporal organization. If the left hand is not prepared, if it's not there, then there's no point forming the tone, right? In fact, some of our processes that we have sort of acquired by default, like the randomness of our decision making, because we just want to do something, has often imposed timing patterns that are very, very difficult to overcome. Constantly left hand late. If the left hand is late, then all I can do is complain about the fact that something is wrong. And my attention will be burdened by that lateness of the left hand. That's one of the factors, only one. So in our organization of our playing, in our attentional organization, because that's what we do when we practice, we structure our attention. We need to work on the timely preparation of the left, and we need to work on the explicit, immediate, and conscious application of the bow. So while we can, for example, mechanize a bit of the left hand in the sense that it becomes automatic, we can't do that in the bow, because the bow needs to feel with immediacy and directness what it's going to do in terms of tone. And then you start to realize that the entire conception of the right has to change or has to be defined in a particular way. So the first thing is that our conception of the bow hand has to be akin to our conception of our lips in the speech act. So in other words, the bow hand is responsible for feeling the articulation, the balance, etc. of the tone. It's not a question of mechanics. It's not a question of a bow hold. There's no such thing. We do not hold the bow. Just like you don't hold your lips, you can't speak anything. You need to use flexibility and feeling in order to direct the bow to the string. One of the things. So we work very much like in string teaching on those principles. Obviously, a whole lot of stuff on arm movement and balance. But what I hope to show, and I stop here, is that some of those foundational ideas, when you think through them clearly, and you think through the ontological determinations, we say, the timing of our activity, the determination through our intentionality, the idea of movement as needing to be balanced. When you think through those things, you can get immediately to an explication of method, because it is most important that when we work on an activity, on any skill, that we recognize the principles of that skill. So when I talk to you about these matters, these are not matters of opinion, actually. These are matters of first principles. You notice we got through the development of this thinking all through reflecting on what this activity actually is, right? And of course there are many more details and much more than I can explore in this short time. But if you start to think this way, you will not only transform potentially the way you work, but you will also be much more effective in your work with your students. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. And if you want to have a few minutes to discuss or ask some questions, I'll be very happy to allow that. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I'd be quite curious to know how, because all these principles resonate with me now that I've had to undo a lot of the thinking processes that I created throughout my
Habitual.
growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how you'd instill some of these like principles of time, for example, to a younger learner.
I think, yes. The matter is quite simple. One thing about movement in relation to instrument is that there's not much difference in the process that's slow and paced to the same process that is fast and rolls off. So the example I use is walking. I walk, the leg carries weight, this recovers. Now I change. But walking is a bilateral process, and it works in a way that I constantly balance my energy, which means I can walk a long time and I can run. The running is not different from the walking. But one thing is for sure, if I can't walk properly, I can't run. Because if I walk like this and now I try to run, I won't be very fast. So the temporal organization of the process can be very slow. And what you do with it, that's when you look at methods. For example, you look at a Russian method book for beginners. It always has stops. Ball, some of you might have started with that. It's never kind of joined straight away, because the idea is move, recover the energy, prepare, anticipate, and move. If you can do that slowly and clearly, you can go because the thinking is easy. What is difficult is a disorganized process that has to be fast. That becomes unsettling and terribly scary, because that remains, the coordination becomes so chaotic that we are standing by and we don't know what's happening. So that's when the amygdala switches us off, right? But that would be my simple answer to that. So when you work with young beginners, respect the fact that they too need to constitute the movement in this way. And they can do it, honestly, very quickly, very easily once they understand it. And the other thing, of course, is that, I've done it with some of you in the chamber music or with some of you in the lessons. If you want to really find out how somebody plays, you take the instrument away and let them mind the process, because it exposes the way they're thinking and what habits get in the way. So we often find constitution of, like, all movement is built on a recruitment of other more elementary movements. If you want to know how you're going to do something that you have never done before, you're going to recruit movement that you're used to doing. What if that movement is not optimal? What if that movement is somewhat corrupted in some ways, whatever, through habit? You need to expose that and clean it up. Now, we never undo movement, I think. We always develop the idea and redo it. Right? And that's actually faster than sometimes we realize. So there used to be in my days this idea that, if you had a technical issue, you needed to sort of start with open string for 6 months and then do this for another. I don't believe in that process, actually. I think it's a very dumb process. I think when we realize that our intentionality changes movement, in other words, our intentionality is responsible for this or this, we realize that we can change movement immediately. I also have questions in for example, Alexander technique. You have this idea of corrupted kinesthesia. And Alexander says, we need to reconstitute this idea with help of others, in other words. When the kinesthesia is corrupted, we can't just change it by will, he says. We can't just use will. Well, I agree with that, but I don't agree that we can't autonomously develop the idea of movement. If we pay careful attention, and if we allow our observation and our reflection to work together well. And If we couldn't do that, I think we would have trouble learning movement altogether. It's a Platonic idea. Plato famously has the idea of learning is recollection. You know everything already. You just have to make it explicit. And Plato's argument is very strong, even though the theory sounds a bit funny. Plato says if that wasn't the case, you couldn't learn at all. And the reason is you couldn't recognize what's better from what's worse. You know? And he shows that in this dialogue called the Meno, which is actually quite relevant for us musicians, where Socrates questions this slave boy on the principles of mathematics and shows this person who is not educated can actually develop their thinking of mathematics to the point where they can say something about the truths of mathematics when they never learned them. So that's how Plato demonstrates this idea of anamnesis, of recollection. And I think it plays a role in our work. That's why we can be effective in practice if we choose to be so. Because you can do things that no one ever told you. Right? Just by thinking, it just needs patience. And it needs a bit of frustration control. You need to know yourself, that you don't just hammer yourself straight away. And that's what we do with the student too. If you observe students and little students and they're trying to do something, and you say, just think, what would you do? And they usually find it. You don't even have to tell them what to do. They will find it. It's natural. If you think how magnificent the violin is constituted in its geometric construction, in its adaptability, in its way of it being incorporated in our bodies, amazing. Yeah. So it's all part of that idea of recollection. Any other questions?
I mean, I guess slightly related. Thing about relearning things or like breaking bad habits.
Yeah.
I mean, I still have bad habits that still linger, but there are periods of time where it's like 3 months of like I just pick it up my violin and it's just completely fine. Everything works, everything's really fluid. But then it always comes back, and then I have to like kind of almost like restart, and then but it always comes back. It's just a bit frustrating. It's just
the way you say it, what it indicates to me is that your thought of how you play is not strong enough. It's not clear enough. You allow yourself to play before you think. And what that means is, like, that's just a very crude statement, because that only might be true for some aspects of your playing. Because as I try to show, the idea that we are working on, let's say it this way, we are working on embodied ideas, temporal embodied ideas. So our idea of what we do is not like a mathematician. Say a mathematician works on 1 + 1 is 2 kind of thing. That's an abstract notion and a simple mathematical idea. Yeah, we're working on very complex embodied ideas, which are particular. Like your idea of your playing is not my idea of my playing, right? Of course, some of the principles are the same, but your idea of your playing has to be developed by you. And I can't even tell you what it is, because I have no access to your consciousness. Yeah, you only have access to your consciousness. So I can see whether you're thinking or not, but that's very interesting, because the movement of your fingers and your bow will change if it is anticipated or if it is just random. So we can always see if a violinist thinks, yeah? Because the movement of, say, just take a simple movement on the left, the movement of a finger into position, say, that is the outcome of an anticipation of that finger in that position, is different from the movement of the finger into position where the anticipation has not occurred, most of the time. Right? You can try it out on each other if you want, but it's very, very clear that that's the case, right? So what happens if you have these notions is that you relax your thought a bit, and then you allow you to move your fingers, and suddenly you think, oh well, I'm there anyway, who cares? Because the automatism might deliver a result. But that shows only that we need to be aware that what we do is not, the outcome is not enough. It depends how we achieve the outcome. If we want to continuously develop our playing, yeah. So in other words, this would have been I had something about intonation. let's talk about intonation, our favorite topic, everyone's favorite topic. 70% of students think intonation is the most important thing they ever need to worry about. And it's true in a way. But intonation is an outcome. Intonation is secondary. Intonation is what is obvious when everything else has already been done. So if you just think, all I need to do is just play in tune, you idiot. I need to play in tune. Well, it matters how you play in tune, right? If you play in tune by fluke, or if you play in tune by automatic habit, then you may not play in tune tomorrow. So you constantly work on that. But if you play in tune by thought, in other words, your idea of what you're doing and where you're going is clear, well then, as long as that idea is clear, you'll play in tune, right? So, of course, that's a complex process. It's hard, well, it's actually not a complex process, but it's hard to describe.
Yeah.
That's the problem. What I'm talking about is actually very simple. We do it in everyday life all the time, like Andrea put her hand in her pocket. It's complex. If we were to describe what happens when somebody puts their hand in their pocket, we'd struggle. That's a difficult phenomenon to describe because all sorts of things play into that. How do you know where your pocket is, right? How does the hand know where the pocket is, etc.? All these things. No, what I'm saying is that some of the reasons in which I've developed my ideas here is based on the notion that it's the phenomenon of our playing that matters. And the phenomenon of our playing is the way our playing is given to our consciousness. But when you read the pedagogical literature, you think what matters is the view. They all have pictures. That's how the bow hand, this is Galamian, triangle, trapezoid, square. Everything is about the visual control of our playing. But the visual control of our playing is a manifestation in the presence. It's too late. Once I see you play, it's too late. We don't work by the visual manifestation of our playing. We may use the visual manifestation of our playing as an aim. So in other words, I stand in front of the mirror, my bow isn't straight. Well, what am I going to do next? Complain that my bow isn't straight? Play 150,000 times hoping the bow will be straight? No, I'm going to aim my bow so it is straight. Just like you put your hand in your pocket, right? But if it never occurred to me that that's actually what has to be done, I might well stand in front of that mirror for the next 6 months until by some random chance I suddenly see and become to the realization that when my bow is straight, I feel like that. But how clumsy is that process? Like that's just too slow, right? And we can't, that's just far too slow. Some of us never get there. Yeah, because we are not lucky enough to win the lottery, right? And the fact that you might win big in the lottery doesn't mean that gambling is a good idea.